There's a hidden class system in the mental health field. At the root of this is a commonly held false belief that the world can be divided into two groups, patients and providers. I've seen enough people of all walks of life to be confident in sharing this truth. When it comes to suffering and the need to heal, the world can't be divided into those who have needs and those who provide care. Human suffering is universal. In fact, many who pursue healing work and many of society's highest achievers, most innovative leaders, and public role models have had their own trauma. To tell this story, I'll be joined by our guest for today's episode, Guy MacPherson, the host of the #1 rated trauma therapist podcast. Guy has interviewed over 500 master therapists, the best minds in the field of trauma. Instead of sharing intellectual insights, though, Guy goes deeper, discussing some of his early childhood trauma and how personal trauma interacts with healing work. Now let's drop into the story. Well, Guy, it's such a pleasure to have you on today. I know that you must have a wealth of information about trauma as someone who hosts the #1 trauma therapist podcast series. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Shauna, it's an honor and a privilege to be on here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm psyched. I'm ready to do it.
All right. Yeah, we get to switch roles today. I've been on your podcast 2 or 3 times, I think. And so let's dive in. I wanted to start with what your definition of trauma is.
Yeah. And that's an interesting question because it certainly has changed because as you might imagine, after interviewing, over 500 people who are working in the field, treating people, there's a broad spectrum of definitions, and as a result, mine has shifted. And I really do think it's important to look at that when we're talking about a definition like that. I think it's important to look at and have in mind a continuum. But I think, and a spectrum in a sense, but I think a working definition for me is an event, an experience that upends, shifts, just causes a shock, an extreme shock to the nervous system that in turn has an impact, a severe impact on a person's life, well-being, body, mind, etc. It's and oftentimes many people think, well, I haven't experienced trauma. I haven't been in a car accident. I haven't been raped. I haven't been to war. But it's much, much more. For example, if I can, speaking of myself, when I was just thinking about this last night, when did this happen? I was in 3rd grade, 4th grade, and I was bullied. And Shauna, that jacked me up for the trajectory of my life. It impacted my self-esteem, how I showed up in relationships, how I thought of myself, how I carried myself was traumatic for me.
Right.
So there you go.
Yeah, no, that is a great example of how, even early childhood experiences that we don't code as trauma right away can impact the rest of our lives.
Right.
How has your definition shifted over time? What's the shift been in terms of how you see trauma?
Right. Well, initially when I got into graduate school, and I was on the quote unquote older side. I was like, I think 35 or 36 when I went back. I had finished my BA. Then I got into graduate school. I thought that, trauma had to be or was this incident, this major incident. I wasn't necessarily considering attachment trauma or more subtle, even virulent forms of trauma, such as relationship-based trauma and how that impacts people. I was aware of it, but it really wasn't until I started doing the podcast and interviewing all these people who their definitions were much broader. And I think this has given me a more open mind about what can be traumatic. And another thing too is, we have to remember that what can be traumatizing for one person isn't necessarily traumatizing for another person.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very easy for people to think, bullying, come on, man, that's kids are like that. Get over it. Well,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that's true, but other times it's not.
Right, right. And what you experienced when you say it jacked you up is it changed your identity. It changed, things about how you responded, your nervous system. It sounds like that was impacted. Can you
Completely.
say anything more about how your definition of trauma shifted to incorporate that understanding that the bullying you experienced was a personal formative trauma for you?
Yeah, it made me realize that there are a couple layers here. So it made me realize that, again, like I said, trauma didn't have to be or wasn't solely defined by a singular incident or
Right.
a major incident. But it can be for many of us more subtle things that we don't often think. So in that way, it changed. The other thing was I felt like, and this is kind of going off on a little tangent here, but I felt, the more I did the podcast, the more it became clear that I almost needed, I felt compelled to kind of speak about my own
Mm.
experience, not
Yeah.
share unethically or without boundaries, but just
Yeah.
it became something I felt I almost needed to do. And quite frankly, what thought I had dealt with in therapy, years before.
Yeah.
But as
Yeah.
it started coming up more and more, I was like, wait a minute, there's something going on here, and it became much more uh, real and immediate. And I felt like in order to move forward personally and on the podcast too, it's something I needed to feel more comfortable talking about and dealing with.
Right, right. Not just sort of compartmentalizing that once you had those realizations that
Right,
this was a trauma and it impacted you.
right,
And to your point, it is these like little kind of insidious, repeated assaults that maybe other people don't see because it's not this big event that causes a sense of helplessness or horror. But sometimes the trauma that we experience is invisible to other people.
right. And the other thing too is, I think if we're talking personally about ourselves, there's the issue of naming it, recognizing it, kind of confronting what oftentimes can be shame. For
Mhm.
me, it took a while to be comfortable talking about the fact that here I am, a guy, a man who was bullied when he was in third or fourth grade, and I'm
Yeah.
still talking about it. But I realized that it was something that I could do and I needed to do. Just
Yeah.
as a something else here, when I was working in Northern California, I was working at uh, a clinic, and we were assessing and treating young individuals who were showing early signs of psychosis. And part of the job was taking these calls, referral calls from therapists and teachers and parents and whomever, wondering if their child was right. And we go through the list of questions and behavior and what's going on, symptoms, and 99, and not surprisingly, but 99.9% of the times there was trauma. But what was surprising to me was that a lot of times the teachers and even therapists and oftentimes parents didn't recognize what
Hmm.
was or could be traumatic. They didn't realize that being bullied could be traumatizing, or witnessing to domestic violence or hearing violence could be traumatizing. And that was a really big eye opener to me, and it really was one of the impetuses for me to start the podcast.
And I think, from my perspective, because you are a man and a respected podcast host and, you understand trauma, it's a gift to tell people, hey, I have personal experience with this. It opens up space for other people to
Mm-hmm.
develop insight about trauma and to reckon with their own suffering more directly.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Um, it's something that I don't really think too much about it now, but moving through that and getting to the point where I was comfortable talking about it, it it wasn't easy, but again, having people on, like yourself who talked about this, it helped me, open up in a sense.
So, what's the story behind the podcast? How did you come to focus on trauma therapists?
When I got into graduate school, I knew I wanted to focus on trauma. It's funny because I didn't realize, I didn't make the connection between my own trauma at the time. Mm-hmm. I just knew that I felt like I could walk into the fire in a sense with someone and be there and hold space for that. And even though I was terrified at part of it, I always thought that it would be really hard to just hear children talk about stories of being abused and so forth. And of course that's always difficult, but it was something that I learned to deal with. But when I was in graduate school, I knew I wanted to do this. And during one of my internships, or a few of my internships, I was doing a lot of commuting back and forth, literally like an hour and a half each way. And I was listening to podcasts, really about entrepreneurs doing kind of incredible things with their lives, And at the same time, literally, I was in the car thinking about my clients, wondering, what the heck am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. How come they're not listening to me? Maybe I should be doing something else, and I always thought, and at that same time, I was going through a training of sensory motor psychotherapy with Janina Fisher, who's a pretty well-known trauma therapist and author and so forth. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be awesome if I had her here in the passenger seat and she could be mentoring me while I was driving? And so I kind of put two and two together and I thought, wait a minute, what if I started a podcast and I interviewed, what I termed or thought would be like master trauma therapists to help other therapists like myself. And that was the start of it. I had never, done this before. I'd never interviewed anyone before. I didn't have any experience. And that's how I started. And I'll stop there, but I can talk about how that whole arc of what I initially thought the podcast was going to be and how what it is now, how that shifted. But that's how I started it.
Wow. And 500 interviews later.
555.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. Good for you. What are some of the guests that you had that kind of stand out, or any particular memorable moments that you can pluck out from those 500 interviews that? Yeah.
It's, I'll answer that by saying that, when I first started, like I said, I wanted, the idea was to interview these, master trauma therapists. And what happened was, one of the questions I would always ask was if my guests could share a mistake or an error. And of course, there's some people who are like, well, I don't make errors or blah, blah, blah. But most people do, know, and
I would say we all do.
We all do. And what I was expecting was, when I first started a few years ago, I was expecting, well, this intervention failed, or, I was reading Bessel van der Kolk's book on page 222, and I was going to implement this particular technique and it didn't work, or I thought it was going to be around techniques. But what I learned was that most people would share experiences of themselves not being themselves, not allowing themselves to be in the moment or be authentic or share in a human, real way, and how that kind of disrupted the process or interfered with just being a human being, just being in the moment, which is what oftentimes, many times, people who've been traumatized need,
right. That authentic human connection. And
yes,
I think sometimes our training as, psychologists, trauma therapists, it runs a bit counter to that. And then sometimes we make choices out of our own anxiety to kind of pull back,
Right.
from really engaging at that level.
Exactly. And that was another eye opener for me, because that realization really encouraged me to look at myself and my own experience. And oftentimes, it invites and almost demands the therapist to look at themselves, because and a lot of times the response is, wait a minute, I got into this to quote unquote help, to fix, to cure other people. You're asking me to look at myself,
from a safer move,
right?
20,000 feet up in the sky.
Exactly. And that whole experience really was a paradigm shift for me, and it really kind of excited me, because it really places the invitation on the therapist, coach, whomever, to cultivate that authenticity, to be themselves, and to allow themselves to be themselves. And of course, I say this with the understanding that I'm not talking about oversharing or doing this unethically or without boundaries, of course. But that to me is really exciting, and at the same time was very scary. But if I may, when I was working at that clinic previously, we had to administer literally a 40-page questionnaire assessment to these young kids. Go through this, and it would take usually a couple hours, and we'd work with a colleague. And I remember this one instance, and I'll never forget this, where it was just not working in a sense. The client, the young kid, was just like, not sharing, not talking, just it wasn't open. And what I did, Shauna, I took this assessment, and I just like, bam, almost like just threw it down on the table.
Rip it up.
Almost ripped it up. And I was like, all right, let's forget this. Just basically an act to say, let's forget this.
Yeah.
And I said to this kid, I just shifted. I said, look, okay, let's forget this. Help me understand what it is that your parents out there, the other therapists who, you used to see, your teacher, what are they not understanding? What are they not getting? Right. And that shift opened things up for this kid and for myself. And it just allowed me to be me and to trust in that process. So that was a huge thing.
Right?
Yep.
It's trusting yourself to be a human in the room.
Right.
And trusting that process, that magic that happens between you and your patient when you bring that authenticity into that room.
Right. And that was a
beautiful,
really thank you. That was a defining moment, not just for me, but for the podcast and for how I approach it and what I focus on. My podcast, it's a trauma therapist podcast, but it's not, it's not really about trauma. It's about the amazing people who do this work. And, what I say is I go in and I dig into their gut, their soul, and I try to squeeze the inspiration out of them. You were asking about a funny story. I had Bruce Perry on, and the first time I had him on, I said, my goal here, Bruce, before we were recording, I said, my goal here is to squeeze as much inspiration out of you as I can. And he said, good luck. And I thought that was pretty funny.
Stella is proud to partner with the Green Beret Foundation. The Green Beret Foundation provides Special Forces soldiers and their families with emergency, immediate, and ongoing support. Through their work, the Green Beret Foundation reduces the burden of life's transitions and covers the cost of life-changing care, including stellate ganglion block, for Green Berets and their partners. Visit www.greenberetfoundation.org to learn more about their mission and how you can support this organization. How do these people that do this work, the trauma therapists that you've interviewed, how does this work impact them, Guy?
Well, and that's the thing. It's there. I mean, people who do this work are drawn, they're compelled to do it. Either, and most often they've experienced their own trauma. They're drawn to helping other people. I mean, come on, this topic is so crazy. It is so intense. However you want to, look at it. It's so intense. I mean, trauma is so intense. The people who do this work are drawn, they're doing it because they're pulled to do it. And to answer your question, it just impacts them in a complete way. It's really challenging. It's really difficult. As Janina Fisher has said, it's very difficult to just do this type of work. I mean, if you're seeing clients, you almost need to work with clients who aren't traumatized because it is so all-consuming. And that is almost like a double-edged sword, because I think the people who I've interviewed, they're just completely dedicated is the word I think I'm using, what I'm looking for. They're completely dedicated to doing this. And for me, there is something so inspiring about talking to someone who is so dedicated to working with people who've been impacted by trauma.
So there is this dedication that people can bring because of sometimes their own experiences. Can there also be a danger, though, from people who have not examined the impact of their own trauma going into this work and really unintentionally doing harm through failing to examine how this has impacted them and then working with patients without going through that process?
Without a doubt. And that's, I think, the number one suggestion that, many of my guests offer to newer clinicians, do your own work. And, that phrase is bandied about, but, what does that mean? That means seeing a therapist most often, looking at your own trauma, exploring your own trauma, looking at your fears, looking at your biases, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. When you're working with someone, you will be triggered. Mm-hmm. And, as one of my guests said, the time to do that work is not when you're in the room sitting in front of your client. You hopefully have done that work before you stepped into that room. Right. Again, as someone else said, if you're working on your own issues when you're working with a client, you're in the wrong room. You should be in your own therapy room. So of course, there's a huge caution and potential for doing harm if that particular person hasn't done their own work. And again, this points to what I was saying previously about therapists oftentimes getting into this work. And I include myself in this initially because I wanted to, help and fix and cure and take people's pain away. And again, this was something that I learned. One of my guests was responding to this, and she said, wasn't speaking exactly to me, but she said, who gives you the right to think that you can take away someone else's pain? Who gives you the right to think that you can fix and cure someone?
Right.
Right. And I was initially, when I first started, I was like, well, isn't that the thing? Well, I'm doing all this reading, I'm taking all these workshops, and that was another shift for me too, to understand that the one of the goals, I'm not going to say the goal, but one of the goals is to, or experience ways, I think, or paths is to walk alongside the
Right.
person you're working with, to be a guide, to be able to do that non-judgmentally, authentically. I'm sorry, let me just stop there. You got me going, Shauna.
No, it's great. It's great. I mean, like my brain is going a million miles an hour too. And I was going to say, I've learned to distrust and pull back when I feel someone, including myself, is too quickly drawn into anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, people, if they fall in love too quickly and they get bound to a relationship too quickly, to immediately sort of pull back and say, why is that? What's going on? Why is it that I'm feeling this pull? And I also think these things are meaningfully related, Guy. That shift, that from our interviews, that's been a major shift for me, is moving out of the position of thinking I'm a savior of any kind and moving into a guide role. And with that shift, I think comes a relationship that is somewhat protective of the therapist in terms of that trauma impact. When you're clear on the boundary about where your responsibility ends and where another person's responsibility begins to heal, that can be a protective factor, can't it?
Right. I agree. Yeah. It's kind of a built-in boundary, protective container or shell or guideline in a sense. I think you're right. It's interesting because again, a lot of times clinicians, certainly newer, again, myself, get into this field because we want to prevent people from feeling what we did, and you go to school, you go through all this training, you get a degree, and there's this almost a natural tendency to feel like, well, of course you should have the answer. If you don't have it, you should certainly get it, be able to get it, procure it. And that is such a different paradigm than being able to be present and to just sit in the room, but not, and I'm not talking about discarding or not honoring the knowledge that therapists have, not at all. But I'm saying, I kind of liken it to, having the suitcase. When I was first seeing clients, I would walk in with my proverbial suitcase filled with all the interventions, and I would, plop it down there on the table, and of course I have all the answers. But instead, it's for me, it's become more like just having it there and trusting that the relationship is so powerful. We are so, as humans, we're so drawn to people who are themselves and who are authentic, who are comfortable in their own bodies. We're drawn to that. We're like, whoa, it's almost like an experience. And to be able to cultivate, I think, that authenticity. And again, I think when I say this, I mean honoring the hills and valleys of our lives. Not everything's perfect, but being able to honor that is such a powerful tool and the foundation for the therapeutic relationship.
Right. And that's part of the authenticity, is acknowledging that there are valleys, for all of us. Right. And you've had kind of a front row seat to how the trauma therapists across the country have been impacted by everything that's played out in the past 2 years, not just the pandemic, but layer upon layer of trauma, mass shootings. About a week ago, there was 80 people that came into the town where I live, very safe community, in masks with crowbars and firearms, and looted the local Nordstroms in 25 getaway cars. So the crime waves and, racial division and political division, trauma upon trauma. And we've tapped our trauma therapists beyond their capacity, it would seem to me, to respond to collective trauma. How are the therapists, in the field? How are they handling it? How are they doing?
That's a big question. And, I think what I'm feeling and sensing from the people that I've been talking to is people are really tired.
Yeah.
People are feeling the weight of this. They're realizing that what we're experiencing now collectively with this pandemic is an ongoing trauma. It's not as if we can look back and say and point to an experience. We're living it now. We're all living it now. And people are feeling that. And I think in a sense, a lot of times people have worked, or I should say a lot of time people have been talking about working remotely, through Zoom, seeing their clients through Zoom. And a lot of people have shared that before this happened, they didn't think that this would be beneficial or they could even do it. But a lot of times people have been reporting to me that they doing this in Zoom, working with people, their clients has helped
teletherapy.
Teletherapy, yeah, excuse me.
Yeah.
It has been helpful for them. But in my experience, a lot of therapists have been feeling the collective weight of the ongoing trauma.
Well, and that's it. To go back to the earliest part of our conversation when we talked about the impact that bullying had on you when you were young, it isn't always a discrete event that causes a sense of helplessness or horror that creates trauma response for us. It can be this collective, cumulative, rolling thunder of different events that keep unfolding. Mm-hmm. The Omicron virus variant, the Delta variant, it just feels exhausting. And the trauma therapist, what's interesting to me is for many years in our culture, as you know so well, Guy, it was, mental health was really needing to come forward as something of value. And we needed to hit a tipping point in awareness that, mental health services have great value and people would benefit from them. I think we've made that argument now. Right. And now that we have the opposite problem of everybody needs therapy for so much of the traumas that we've all been subjected to over such a long period of time with perhaps no clear endpoint in sight right now.
Unfortunately, yeah, I have to agree. I think you're right. I mean, I think trauma is a word that has certainly come into the foreground of our culture. I think there's still obviously a lot of work to do in terms of people becoming comfortable with talking about it and sharing it. Despite all the celebrities and sports figures who, thankfully and courageously have come out and talked about it. I still think there's a ways to go, of course, but I'm confident and thankful for the advances that are being made. So,
yeah, I mean, to go back to your definition, if trauma is something that upends our lives, I mean, certainly many of us have had our lives upended. And I think part of the answer is talking about the stuff that's easier to talk about, those changes and shifts that we've all experienced. Not really jumping to, the deepest level of trauma, but really, more people being comfortable talking about more of that stuff. Mm-hmm. So just a couple more questions for you. What do you think that people can do if they're healers or peer supporters supporting those with trauma to protect themselves against its impact?
Well, to me, it always, again, Shauna, comes back to being willing to, look at yourself, to do that inner work, to cultivate authenticity, and to look at how you are triggered. What are your fears as a person? What are your biases? Doing that work, I think, is of the utmost important. And as you talked about, potentially it could be a real, true protective um, barrier in a sense. And that's not even the right word, but I think that is of the utmost important for people who are doing this work.
Yeah, I totally agree. As you know, and I think when I came on your podcast, we talked about, if I remember correctly, a couple times when I'd become tearful in session as a therapist, and how I was so embarrassed and so, wanting to control myself and lock that down. But, to our earlier conversation, how actually the patients that I became tearful with said that was really helpful for them to really have me be fully human and feel that pain, not my own pain, but to be attuned to them at a level where I was really kind of perceiving and empathizing with their pain was
Yeah.
actually one of the really helpful things that happened that I was so afraid of at one time.
That's awesome. I mean, that's so inspiring to me. It reminds me of one of my guests said, and she said, the ability for the therapist to do that, exactly what you did, to be present and authentic, is not just for the therapist, but what that does is provides an opportunity for the client to know that they are impacting someone, that they're having an impact in a human way. How amazing is that?
Right. Right. So maybe we should lock ourselves down a little less as long as we do the work.
Right.
As long as we do the work. So we're sure that what we're projecting is not our own stuff and our own needs, but really focused on each of our patients. So as we close out, and this has been so much fun, and thank you for coming on. I'd love to give you a final word about, what is one thing about trauma that you think everybody should know more fully that they don't know now?
Right. Well, I think that, it's pretty safe to say that most of us humans on this planet have been impacted by trauma on some level. Again, if we think about trauma being defined on a continuum. And for those who, are listening to this, who are maybe thinking to themselves that they have been traumatized, I would encourage them to find a therapist, and don't stop until you find that person who you feel comfortable with, because it's really difficult to click with a therapist. It's hard, right? Oftentimes we look for a therapist and we're like, no, and then we stop. And on the other side, for clinicians, people who are working with others, I would encourage them to, do that courageous work of honing their authenticity and looking at their own traumas and honoring who they are as people, not as some idealized therapist or psychologist or whomever.
In reflecting on Guy's story, it's clear that our trauma can be invisible to those around us. Sometimes it can be invisible to us. Early childhood experiences that we don't think of as traumatic can sometimes have a long-term impact on us. And trauma doesn't always come from one big event that creates a sense of helplessness or horror. It can come from the cumulative impact of ongoing relationship traumas. Whether we're licensed professional healers or not, authenticity creates the space for others to heal. If a patient means one who suffers, we're all patients. Understanding this truth is critical in helping us connect with those who are suffering. Post-traumatic stress is not a life sentence. Trauma can be healed with the right insights, the right treatments, and the right support. The story of our trauma is presented by Stella. Visit www.stellacenter.com to learn more about Stella's breakthrough trauma treatments. Please share this episode with people you care about who have been impacted by trauma. And remember to subscribe on Spotify and other streaming platforms.